Hello everybody, it's George again reporting in from Bridgewater in Somerset here in England. And once again I'd like to start with the news from LA, which is not good. A lot of people have lost everything over there. I'm happy to report that Dawn at the moment is safe, although she is in an area of concern up in the high desert. She has been keeping us updated and she is suffering power outages, which is inconvenient. But at the moment, there is no threat of fire. So keep our fingers crossed and keep praying for her. And for those who've lost so much in Los Angeles, it's very, very sad. Right, so part two of my family military history, which takes us on to the World War II years. I was going to try and cover all of my parents' generation in this, but I've done a bit of planning. And I've realised that just my parents' story is effectively the script for a Hollywood blockbuster or a book indeed. So I will just be concentrating on my mum and dad today because their story is really quite remarkable. It's a story of rescue, intrigue, romance, love rivalry, D-Day, heroism, death, tragedy, and then ultimately happy ever after. So, Dad left school in pretty much 1939, 1940, I think, and went straight into the Merchant Navy with the Peninsula and Orient line, the P&O line. So he was a merchant seaman. And at that time, Mum was based in Hong Kong as the daughter of a serving Royal Navy officer. So when things deteriorated in the Far East and we were under threat in Singapore and Hong Kong, my father was sent to evacuate the dependents of the Royal Navy out there, which included my mother and her sister, and also my grandmother. So they were successfully evacuated, successfully rescued, and on the return journey back to England, Grandma spotted Dad as a young, dashing naval officer, but 2 years older than my mother, who would have been about 16 at the time, I think. And so she engineered, shall we say, that they came across each other rather a lot. She considered Dad to be a good suitor for Mum, so she made sure that they fell in love, basically, and they fell in love on the journey back home. That is the romance of it, if you like. So a bit of an intrigue from Grandma as well. She was very, very clever in what she did. So, this romance then led to a wartime engagement to be married. And Dad then proceeded to continue his service with the Peninsula P&O line and was in the North Africa convoys. During the North Africa convoys, very inconveniently, a Junkers 88 dropped a bomb down the funnel of his ship, and that was causing an immediate evacuation of the ship. So it was basically everybody get off the ship. Dad didn't get a lifeboat. He ended up bobbing around in the Mediterranean for 6 hours, and then it was thankfully picked up by a Royal Navy minesweeper. He was delivered to Algiers harbour, where he sat for a while, and eventually was evacuated back to England. Funny story involved with this, because Dad obviously had his own cabin, being a young officer, and in that cabin, which still exists, there is a bottle of gin in his locker. And he said to me, jokingly, many years ago, he said, "George, if ever you take up diving," he said, "I'm going to give you the coordinates of where that ship sank, because I'd like my bottle of gin back, please." Of course, it never happened, but it was just a little interesting story, which is quite amusing in some ways. So, so then, obviously, Dad, we'll come back to Dad in a minute, but during this time, Mum was living in Plymouth, because my grandfather was a Plymouth dockyard man, and Plymouth was hit quite badly by the German bombing campaign in World War II. Now, she had an Anderson shelter, an air raid shelter in the bottom of the garden, which is where, when the air raid sirens went off, she would go with the family to take shelter. Now, the bombing campaign had a sort of set routine, because what would happen is the first wave of Luftwaffe bombers would come over and drop incendiary bombs on Plymouth to light up where the areas where they wanted the second wave of bombers to actually drop the high explosive bombs. Now, the residents of Plymouth soon learned that there was a gap between the incendiaries and the high explosive bombers. So what they did during that time, the civil in the role of civil defence, was to come out of the Anderson shelter with buckets of mud and earth, and any incendiary bombs that were within range of them, they would actually douse them with earth. So it's quite a brave thing to do, to say the very least. And then before the high explosive bombs would come in, they'd be back in the safety of the Anderson, or the relative safety of the Anderson shelter. So that was Mum's role during the Plymouth Blitz, which was again a tale of courage, basically. So there you go. Right. In the meantime, Dad, having been sunk in the Mediterranean, was decided to stay at sea, but he transferred to the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. He was a lieutenant in the Coastal Command section of the Royal Navy, which meant he was on motor torpedo boats for the rest of the war. I think our American friends call them P-boats, and the P-boats themselves were the subject of a film called They Were Expendable, starring John Wayne, which was my mother's favourite film when we were growing up, because obviously Dad was on MTBs, which were the equivalent. The MTBs that Dad was on was the Fairmile boat, the dog boat, which was slightly bigger than the original, the earlier series. And so he spent the rest of the war basically keeping the U-boats at bay in the North Sea. So that was really Dad's remainder of the war. So as I said, Mum and Dad were engaged to be married, and they were very much in love. And then along came 1944, and they arrived. Who are they? They were the overpaid, oversexed, and over here. In other words, our great friends and allies, the Americans. So obviously we hosted them in the lead up to D-Day, and some were based in Plymouth. And Mum struck up a friendship with a dashing young lieutenant who had his own Jeep, and she has often spoken fondly of those days of gallivanting, she called it, in the lieutenant's Jeep. So and she suspects very much that he kind of had a thing for her, but they became great friends. And she assures me it was all innocence and good fun. But there was definitely a love rivalry there between Dad, who was away on his boat, and the young lieutenant who was getting ready for D-Day. However, come May the 25th of 1944, the love rivalry was basically terminated because Dad got a ring on Mum's finger in Weymouth on May the 25th, and they were married. D-Day occurred barely 2 weeks later, if that. In fact, about 2 weeks later, June the 6th of 1944. The young lieutenant then disappeared off the scene, and he was at the D-Day landings. And also, just a little side story here, my mum's best friend, Pat, growing up, took up with a GI called Marty, and I knew her as Auntie Pat. And she actually went back to Arizona with Marty, and they got married and raised a family and lived pretty much happily ever after. I met them a couple of times. Very nice people, and it was so that was one story of how the Americans came and stole our woman. But thankfully Mum stayed with Dad, otherwise I wouldn't be here telling the story, would I? So there we go. So yeah, D-Day came. Marty was on D-Day, and so was the young lieutenant. They both survived it, obviously. Marty survived the war. The young lieutenant then went on with Patton's Third Army, and so there was a town called Bastonia. Some of you will know the series The Band of Brothers, which told the story of Bastonia and how it was basically under siege from the German army, and the Band of Brothers held it. They were known as the Battered Bastards of Bastonia, and Patton and his Third Army were tasked with going and relieving the siege of Bastonia. During that advance on Bastonia, the young lieutenant lost his life. Very sad, but hey, that's war, I guess. So there we go. That is the death and the tragedy which I spoke about earlier, and also the heroism, of course, because he survived D-Day and then was going to relieve his band of brothers up in Bastonia when he laid down his life. Yeah, so so as we know, shortly after that, in May 1945, the war in Europe came to an end with VE Day, which I think may have been May the 7th or thereabouts. And then within a month, my oldest brother was born in 1945, June the 2nd, 1945. Dad demobbed from the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve shortly after the end of the war. And he went off to Cambridge University because they were basically, the demob servicemen were kind of offered a scholarship, or basically an opportunity to carry on with their education, because Dad obviously could not do so. It was a 6-year gap in between him leaving school and then going to Cambridge. He became he got his degree from Cambridge University in science, and then he went on to have a very successful career as a scientist in a company called British Cellophane, which is where I come along later. So yeah, that is a story of Mum and Dad in the Second World War. As I say, there's tragedy, there's love, there's romance. If any Hollywood producer out there would like to come and speak to me, I'm open to offers. You never know. Right, in the meantime, that's it for today, and I shall come back in the not too distant future, probably next week, with the story of the mum and dad's siblings and their husbands and wives, and how they saw service in the Second World War, which includes a D-Day, another D-Day story, the story of a bomber command. My Uncle John was a navigator on a Halifax bomber. My Uncle Eric, who married my mother's younger sister, he flew the Swordfish. And yeah, so we'll come back to that. Anyway, so thanks for tuning in again, folks, and I hope you enjoyed this little chapter of the military history. Stay safe, everybody, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye for now.